Unfortunately, I don't have the personality of Jeff Stearns, so you're going to have to get used to this dull monotone for the rest of the time. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for having me out here. I know that you've come out here on basically a holiday, on Black Saturday, would we call it? I'm not sure. But thank you very much for coming out here. It's very cool to be here. And I wanted to thank my brother Scott, as Jeff did. Scott opened up a music shop. He decided to follow his bliss and follow his dreams, just as I followed mine. And he opened up a shop in downtown Purcellville. It's got great services. You know, if you're into music, if you want to learn about music, if you want to take lessons or rent instruments, please go there and support local business here in Purcellville. So thank you, Scott. And I wanted to tell a few stories while I'm out here today. So I'm going to start from one. I'll start with a story from my high school days. I went to Bishop McNamara High School, which was an all-boys school in Forestville, Maryland. And we were generally well-behaved, but we did have a teacher named Mrs. Humphreys who didn't command a lot of respect. And so the kids in her classroom really acted kind of like wild animals. And so then, on the day when it came, for us to get our grades, everybody's a little nervous because everybody had misbehaved all year long, hadn't done their homework, hadn't studied for quizzes, and now it's time to get our grades. You know, we hadn't looked into the future. And so the teacher, Mrs. Humphrey, started to go around to each student and give out their grades. But she was one of these people that didn't have a whispering voice. So she went up to the first kid and she leans into him and goes, C, right? I'm not sure, my mic's on, right? Okay, this only works with a microphone. So each kid, she went, C. And so we were all kind of relieved because it meant we weren't going to fail, which we deserved. And then finally she got to this kid named Massimo Tenaglia, who was actually a really well-behaved kid, the only one in the class. And she went up to him and she goes, C. And Massimo completely freaked out. You know, he flipped out, flipped his lid, and he said, what? I'm the only person in here who studied. I did my homework. I studied for pop quizzes. How could you give me a C? And there was this moment of silence in the class because we didn't know how she was going to react. And so there was another moment of a pause, and then Mrs. Humphrey leaned into him and says, B. And so I love funny stories. I feel like I've been collecting them my whole life. My story of becoming a cartoonist or an author is actually really a twisting and turning story. So I'll tell you a little bit about that here. I did not want to be a cartoonist. I certainly didn't want to be a children's author. Well, actually, I wanted to be a cartoonist, but a newspaper cartoonist. And I had a comic in college called Igdoof. And this is my cartoon character sitting on the toilet. So you can see that not much has really changed. And I see the book in the front row. My editor from the newspaper is in the front row, Drew Weaver, who lives in Leesburg. It's so funny. So Igdoof has some roots here in the Virginia, Maryland area. But I wanted to be a newspaper cartoonist, but the problem was I couldn't break into the business. I spent about 3 years drawing and trying to get in, and I just kept getting lots of rejection letters. Before that, I thought that I was going to hit the big time. Here is a very cocky-looking 22-year-old version of myself. I was featured in the Washington Post, and they told me I was going to, take on the real world and hit the big time, but I just got lots of these instead. For any artists or musicians or anybody that has an artful soul, you'll get lots and lots of these. It's an anonymous letter, and it might as well just have the word no on it. But that's what my life was like for a long time. But then I had this idea. I said, you know what? I'm not a very good illustrator, but what if I started illustrating as a 7th grader? And what if I started writing as a 7th grader? Then nobody could doubt my artistic talents. And that's where the idea for Diary of a Wimpy Kid was born. And I wanted to just dive right in and start drawing and writing. And I said, I got this idea. I'm going to make my book. But I said, wait a second. I'm going to first fill up this sketchbook with ideas, with jokes. And so here's the very first page of that sketchbook. And you can see that right in the middle there to the left is the first drawing ever of Greg. And right in the dead center is the first drawing of Rowley. And I thought that this would take me just a little while, maybe a few months. And I'll tell you in a few moments how long it actually took me. But when I was a kid, like I said, I feel like I sort of collect stories. I love stories about childhood. I remember when I was a kid, and if I would go to church or if I'd be in school, and some authority figure got on the stage and started a story with, when I was a kid, I was just locked in. I wanted to hear what they had to say, because no matter how crusty the authority figure was, I wanted to hear about their childhood, because that was a glimpse into their humanity. And so I've been collecting stories, and I sort of trade in stories with my family members. We retell the same stories again and again, and a lot of those stories have made their way into my books. I was on the swim team in Fort Washington, Maryland. We had to get up at like 7 in the morning. It was ice cold in the pool. And my little brother, Patrick, who's here somewhere, he probably doesn't like being called a little brother at 33, but he likes to tell a story that his first ever swim meet, they told him that they were going to shoot the starter pistol up in the air, and then everybody should jump in the water. My brother was a lot more concerned about where that bullet was going to land than getting to the other end of the pool. So that's where I got that idea from one of my books. Like I said, I was also on the swim team. I was a very enterprising kid. I decided that swimming and practicing was not for me. So I used to go down to the creek and capture tadpoles and then make it back just in time for my father or mother to pick me up from swim team. And one day I was late, so I showed up like behind my father, who was looking into the pool, like trying to figure out where I was in all these writhing bodies, with my bag of tadpoles. Eventually I decided that I should just hide out from my swim coach in the locker room instead. And so this is a pretty good depiction of that. Only it was like pitch black, because it was one of those bathrooms where the lights didn't turn on if nothing was moving. So I didn't want to die of hypothermia, so this is what I did. It's my proudest moment. My sons are somewhere here in this audience, so kids, don't do as your father does. Another story from my childhood that actually made its way into the movie, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, was from my older brother Scott, who is not mean and creepy like Roderick, but he did pull this trick on me. He woke me up on the very first day of summer, told me that I had slept through the whole summer, that it was the first day of school, and that I had slept through the family trip to Disney World. And so that's a pretty good picture of what that looked like. I'm finding that some stories that were a part of my childhood or growing up, my teenage years, made their way into my subconscious and then kind of came out in my books. I was going through my garage a few months ago, and I came across a picture that is very funny. This is a blurry picture of my, you can barely see it, a blurry picture of my high school girlfriend's mother, who accidentally took a picture of herself when she grabbed the camera off of a shelf. And so when I saw that, I just thought it was the funniest thing in the world. I just fell down on the floor laughing. And then many years later, in my second book, Roderick Has a Party, and one of the teenagers accidentally takes a picture of it. And so you can see it's very similar to that picture I found in my garage. Here's just a random story, something that happened to me recently. Like I said, I tell a lot of stories in my books from my childhood, but I also use my imagination, of course, and then I pick up things in my day-to-day life. Here's a story that I'd love to find a way to get into the book somehow. A few months ago, I live in Plainville, Massachusetts now, and a few months ago, there was a really busy day. I had a lot going on. I had lumber being delivered, clapboard for the front of the house. I had the yard people coming to put chemicals in the grass, and a bunch of other things were going on as well. I'm fighting a sneeze, so if you see me making funny faces here, that's what's going on. I'm going to let it out in a second here. But when the yard people were coming, ChemLawn, I really wanted to talk to the people. I said, call me 5 minutes before you get here, because I really want to go over my lawn with you. They said, no problem. They called me. I met them at the front door. So I started walking this gentleman around my yard, and I said, here's a pine tree. The grass doesn't grow under this. And he said, well, you need 5 hours of sunlight a day. You might want to limb up these trees and then use Scott Sunshade, et cetera, et cetera. And then we went to each area, and he said, you've got a grub problem here. You should get Grub Killer. And we kept going, and as we were moving our way to the backyard, he was getting more and more hesitant with his answers. And I figured that was happening, because he just wants to lay the chemicals down and then move on. But I was insistent. I wanted to get all of my questions answered. And then finally I said, you know, let's go to the backyard now. And the guy, that's where he drew the line. And he said, hey, listen. He goes, I'm just the lumber guy. And sure enough, on the street was a semi filled with clapboard. So I love stories like that. And I would just say to everyone out here, you know, my books are not, there's nothing magical about my books at all. They're just a collection of funny stories, you know, that could happen in real life. And for every kid here, I'd recommend that you keep a journal. You know, parents too, I'd recommend you keep a diary. Just write down the funny things that happen in your life, because, you know, you'll have a lot of funny stories all in one place if you do. And so anyway, after 4 years of writing down everything I could remember, everything I could imagine, this was the very last page of my journal, right? That's not actual size, but it was, I actually wouldn't be able to read that now because my eyes are so bad. But it took me 4 months just to do that one page, my very last page. And by that time I was ready to start writing my book. So in 2004, I started posting my entries on funbrain.com, which is a kid's website. And it was very cool. I would publish something at like 4 in the morning, and then I'd immediately get responses from people in China, Pakistan, Greece, who read what I just wrote. And it was really cool. Like, the kids in this audience are used to things traveling at the speed of light across the world. But for people in my generation and older, if you had a pen pal and you wrote 2 letters in a year, you know, that was like a really good pen pal relationship. So things have changed a lot. I'll show you, I brought my sample packet in 2006 to something called New York Comic Con. And this is kind of the scene. And I walked my sample packet around. Nobody really wanted to look at what I had. But then I ran into an editor who, he took a look at my sampling of my work, and he said, you know, this is exactly why we're here, and this is what we're looking for. So I just really lucked out. Most, you know, cartoonists, artists, writers have to spend about 5 years before they can get an agent and then, you know, have success. So I feel really lucky that after a long time of trying to get into comic strips, I did have success with my books right away. And one of the funny parts of this story is that I actually didn't write my books for children at all. I wrote one big fat book for adults. It was about 1,300 pages long. I had intended for an adult audience, not kids, and here was the very first cover. So not many people have seen this, but you know, it looks pretty boring, but that's because it was written for people my age. But of course my publisher said, listen, you've written a children's series, you just didn't do it on purpose. And that's what happened. But along the way I started getting emails from teachers and parents who said, my reluctant reader, this is the first book they've ever read. And I kept getting those emails, and they'd use that same exact phrase, reluctant readers. And it's funny to say it now that I know what reluctant readers are, but I just thought it was a coincidence that everybody was using the same exact phrase. And now I understand that reluctant reader is just code word for boys. So hi, all you boys out there who won't read anything else. But once I realized I was writing for boys who didn't like to read, you know, and thank you to the girls also that read my books, but I started to have some fun with it. I was home on break about 1.5 years ago, and there was an article in the paper that said, in the Washington Post, that said, mother-son book club sure to be a hit. And I was like, thank you, gods of comedy, because you've just written part of my next book. So in the book, Mom starts a reading is fun club, and you know, for all the neighborhood boys in the summer. And of course the boys have, well, Mom has her ideas of what the boys will like to read, right? Little Women, The Yearling, Old Yeller, Anne of Green Gables. Basically an animal has to die somewhere in those books for them to be considered classics. The boys have their own ideas of classics. You know, video game cheat guide and pop-up sharks and things like that. So you boys know what we're talking about here.